Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mustafa Abedini Fard. I'm a faculty in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. It's my pleasure being back with my dear team for the spring and winter 2022 series in the Alireza Ahmadian lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies. Today, we are honored to have two guests, as you can see in the poster. But before giving more information, I would like to acknowledge that although we are gathering virtually, UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As I was mentioning, today we are honored to have two guests, a speaker and a discussant. As you noticed in the poster, the talk is titled "The Changing Diet of the Iranians from Quasi-Vegetarians to Quasi-Carnivores," which will be delivered by Dr. Floor, and then he will be joined by Dr. Mehravari as a discussant. Before introducing our speaker and discussant, I would like to also express my gratitude towards my team, Connie, on our closed captioning provider and volunteer, Ms. Nazgul Tawakkulizadeh, and of course, Dr. Farzan Kermani for the amazing poster designs that he has done for us. I would also like to ask you that if you have any questions during the speech, please insert them in the chat box. And of course, we're going to make sure that they are addressed as much as time permits. With that said, I would like to, and another important point here regarding closed captions. Which again will be provided by Nazgul at the same time and live. We're trying to make the lectures as inclusive as possible. So if anyone for any reasons, might need closed captions, please make sure that you will turn on the live transcript option at the bottom of your page. I would like to introduce our speaker first. Today's presenter, Dr. Willem Floor, studied development economics and non-Western sociology, as well as Persian, Arabic, and Islamology from 1963 to 67 at the University of Utrecht, the Netherlands. He received his doctoral degree from the University of Leiden in 1971. Since 1983, Dr. Floor was employed by the World Bank as an energy specialist. However, after his retirement in 2002, he has dedicated his time to the study of the social and political history of Iran and has published extensively throughout this time. We normally ask our the speakers and discussants to provide the bio themselves, and I can say this is a humbly shortened version of what could be a very long introduction, to Dr. Floor and his work. Today's discussant, Dr. Nader Mehravari, has been studying the principles and practices of Persian cookery for the past 30 years, initially as a serious side activity and now post-retirement full-time. His current research interests include historical, cultural, and social practices relating to the preparation and consumption of food within the global Iranian diaspora community. He puts his research into practice by recreating traditional and authentic Persian dishes in a modern Western home kitchen, while carefully documenting associated methods behind individual and classes of dishes. He aims to create an innovative cookbook where accurate historical information and modern food science techniques are compiled for modern Western home kitchens. His academic and professional background is in science, engineering, and technology, which allows him to incorporate a structured and scientific approach into his culinary passion. He received his PhD from Cornell University in 1982. He is a retired corporate executive, has taught at Cornell, Syracuse, and Princeton universities, and has published extensively. He is currently a research associate at the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences at University of California, Davis. He also volunteers at the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. And with that, I also would like to mention that, again, thanks very much. I can see that the number of the audiences has increased. Thanks everyone for joining us. As I was going through the audiences, I noticed that the Iran historian, Dr. Hushain Shahabi, is also joining us today. And I know from personal experience that he's also an excellent cook. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Shahabi, and everybody else, of course. With that, I would like to ask the audience to please welcome Dr. Floor. Dr. Floor, please.
Good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are, everybody. As you know, we are going to talk about the changing diet of Iranians. Possibly like me, before I delved into the subject, I thought that the staple food of Iranians was cholo kebab. Well, that is not true, unfortunately, not even today. Can I have the first slide, please? What we should realize when we talk about a country like Iran is that it was until even, let's say, 70 years ago, or even 60 years ago, an agricultural country with undeveloped infrastructure. So people basically lived in their villages and had very little contact with the outside world. And that meant, let's say, of the 10 to, let's say in 1900, when you had about 10 million people, that 9 million people basically were not very much aware of what was happening in the outside world. And the best thing that you knew was maybe the provincial capital, which they rarely saw either. Can I have the next slide, please? When you look, let's say, over the centuries, and I mean, let's say the last 2,500 years, roughly speaking, then we see that basically Iranians continue to eat the same food. What is outstanding in the diet is bread, which is basically represent 50 to 60% of the energy intake. And that was accompanied by vegetables, fruit, yogurt, and nuts. Meat, rice, and sugar were luxury foods for most consumers and were rarely eaten. Moreover, even if you wanted to eat meat, you were subject to Islamic law that banned the eating of certain animals, for example, pork. There was a lot of boars around in the rural area, so you could have eaten to your heart's desire. The hare was not allowed, oysters, crabs, etc. So they limited also the choice. If, let's say, people had a normal year, and don't forget, let's say, very few peasants in their life had a life with only normal years, because if there was no famine due to rain, to winter, to locust, or to war, then you didn't have a normal diet and you were starving. But if, let's say, if it was a normal year, then usually they had a sufficiently nutritious diet, although it was deficient in proteins and vitamins. Next slide, please. I said in general the diet didn't change that much, but there were, of course, all kinds of differences. For example, you had regional differences. Iran is a country that has few rivers on the mainland, but let's say in the north of the Caspian Sea, which is rich in fish, as well as the Persian Gulf. And of course, you find that people ate fish there. there was some export of salted fish to the interior, but very little. Although there are some rivers and streams in Iran where fish was caught, it was rare that people did that in rural areas. There were also, of course, the difference between rural and urban, and of course rich and poor. Rich had a better diet, a more variegated one than the poor. In fact, despite, let's say, the difference between rural and urban, and they were there, essentially didn't substantially differ that much from the rural areas. I should also point out that there was a difference for everybody, except for the rich, of course, in the seasonal diet, especially towards the end of winter. People were at the end of their stocks, and they were suffering and hoping that the March rains would bring relief and better crops for the next year. As I said earlier, normal year there was sufficient calories, and I will come to that later, but I'll just say it right now so that it doesn't come as a total surprise. There were dietary changes as of the 19th century. Next slide, please. Let's first look at the urban diet. It's very interesting, let's say, that 2,500 years ago, if you were saying that you were eating or to invite someone to eat, you did say non khordan. That was in Pahlavi or in Middle Persian, and that literally means really eating bread, which already indicates that how important bread was in people's diet. Although Iran is a major, or was a major producer of wheat, that was basically mostly for the rich. The poor ate barley bread, or depending on the region and how the crop had been, they ate also other grains like millet and other stuff. But barley was basically mainly for the poor. It's interesting, let's say, that this preponderance of bread continued until today. And I quote here, let's say, a 13th century traveler, Ibn Battuta, who came from Morocco. And I quote here from his rihla, from his travelogue, where he said, you know, if he was invited to come and somebody's home for a meal, they said, come along with me for a meal of naan and mas, that is, mean bread and yogurt. Rice, you know, I started off this talk with pointing out that the notion that rice was a staple is an erroneous one, because apart from, let's say, southern Khuzestan and some of the Caspian provinces, no rice was eaten in the mainland in the early centuries. But even, let's say, in provinces like the Caspian and Khuzestan in the south, they were not eating, let's say, pulo or chilo. They basically ate khubz al-aros, that is rice bread, and was not only in Iran, also in Iraq. The greater, let's say, spread of rice as a normal dish took a long time. In fact, the first time that in Persian sources the word pulo occurs is in a poem by Ohadi, so around 1300. But even, let's say, when there's the unfortunate fact that we don't have cookbooks for Iran until the 16th century. But let's say, and there is the poems from the Timurid period that mention rice, but we should not forget, let's say, that rice, in the first place, rice needs a lot of water, and Iran doesn't have a lot of that. Given the isolation of most of the population, that rice was not even available to them, even if they knew about it. As a result, rice was not a staple. Next slide, please. Now we come to the rural diet. What did peasants eat? Now we have to realize that let's say agriculture in Iran until let's say the 1930s was basically for autoconsumption. People raised enough food for their own survival, plus let's say the share to pay taxes and whatever. And what you see then, that peasants consumed mostly unleavened barley, sorghum or millet bread, or a combination thereof, accompanied by curds, sour milk, yogurt, cheese, whey, buttermilk, and herbs. A lot of herbs, actually, in fact. And in summer, they ate a lot of fruit, in particular cucumbers and melons, and I should say grape, of course. What we know from the 19th century, the first time that we get a little bit of hard data, that the monthly need of a person was about between 20 and 25 kilograms per person. It's interesting, we have those data both from, for example, from Khorasan in the north to Fars in the south. It's interesting, let's say bulgur is a kind of grits, was a staple food, especially of the Turkish-speaking population, as a substitute for rice. You find that in particular, let's say, in Azerbaijan, but also, let's say, among the Turkoman in Khorasan. As I said earlier, meat was really a luxury and was only eaten on special occasions, such as feast days and weddings, and was basically only eaten by the affluents. And they didn't eat meat every day. It's interesting, let's say, that the soups, the stew, the abgosh, the soup, and the pottages, the halim, which nowadays have meat in them, in those days were purely vegetarian. Next slide, please. As I said also earlier, there are regional difference. I pointed already out that both in the Persian Gulf and in the Caspian Sea area, fish was eaten. But let's say in the Caspian Sea, the staple, certainly, let's say, probably as of the year 1000, was beginning to be rice. People did not eat bread, although they ate something like rice bread, and let's say, but wheat bread was only to be found in the large towns. But only in the mountainous areas where wheat and barley were grown that you had that bread and dairy products were the staple, and only rice was eaten at lunch. In the Persian Gulf, rice was not a staple, but it was dates, together with salt fish and onions, enhanced by fruit. It's interesting, for example, if you go to Bushir, it's in the south, and you're invited to for a meal, they ask you for to come for oh dear, I forgot, nuna piyaz. That means bread and onions. Nomads lived on a diet like the sedentary rural population, on barley bread, yogurt, and buttermilk, and also very little milk. You know, these are the people who have large herds of all kinds of animals, but they couldn't afford to eat. They were very poor. And in fact, you know, their very existence depended on their ability to sell those animals to others, so they could afford the things that they couldn't make themselves. So some of them were so poor, and with a large group like the Qashqai's and Bakhtiaris, were Mamasani, very large, hundreds of thousands of people, for 6 months of the year, ate acorn bread due to poverty. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, as I said earlier, we getting changes in the 19th century. One major change that occurred in the diet was the arrival of tea. Tea existed in Iran before the 19th century, but basically as a medicine, and only then only for the very rich. Tea was introduced by the Russians. There were in 1828 about 30,000 Russian troops in Tabriz. What did they do? They drank tea, and as a result, tea slowly took over from coffee, which until then was the major drink in Iran. By the end of the 19th century, coffee was marginal at best, and only drunk, let's say, as a normal drink in the Persian Gulf littoral, and here and there pockets and at funerals. Bread also, although bread was very important, as I said, but we see also new types of bread becoming introduced. The first one was sangak, which is probably from the 16th century. Then barbari, that both are very nice breads, by the way, was introduced around mid-19th century. Then you get in the 1930s nana bulki. That is, it's a Russian word. It refers to a bun. And then, let's say, in the modern times, like nana toast and nana fantasy, all kinds of things you get. Also, new vegetables became part of the diet, like say the potato, which had a very slow dispersal in the Persian diet, but certainly, let's say, in the early 20th century during famines, it was an important input for survival. Okra and artichoke, well, granted limited, but became part of the diet, as well as, let's say, tomato and strawberries. And as you can see, goji farangi, tute farangi indicate that they were of European origin. Although there was a type of strawberry in northern Iran, but it was different from the European one. We also see that rice eaters are going to eat more bread, and bread eaters are going to more rice in the 20th century. Sugar, which always, I mean, Iranians love sugar. I remember the first time I came to Iran and had my tea there, half of my cup was full of sugar, which I really didn't like. But people usually couldn't, in the past, people couldn't afford sugar because it had all to be imported and it cost a lot of money. But as of with the economic growth, etc., higher income, people were able to afford these luxuries, like sugar and rice. Meat also became less of a luxury, not in the great quantities, but for example, in the stews and in the soups, people could afford to put pieces of meat in them and get thus a more varied diet. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, Dr. Floor. Dr. Floor, I'm so sorry for interfering. Yes,
sure.
Apparently, your camera might have moved a little bit down. So.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not
sorry
feeling
about
down.
that.
I'm not feeling down if that's what you think. No.
Sorry, I hated to interfere, but yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see. Oh dear.
Sometimes moves down. Thank you.
I hope you can all see me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Wave if you can see me. Anyway, I'll give here on this slide one of the few data that we have on income spending. It was done in 1937, a middle-class family. And you can see, let's say, how much was spent on food, 56%, which is quite a lot. And that cereals were an important part of that. Meat was less so, and of course vegetables as well. But we have to realize this was a middle income class family, and that was a very small segment of society. I mean, 90%, if not more of the population was poor, dirt poor. Despite, let's say, all these changes and things that became available in the market, in the 1950s, bread, for example, was still the most important food item. And meat represented only 2% of low-income diets. And that share of bread in the Persian diet continued also in the 50s and 60s and thereafter. And in those days, accounted for 70% of daily calorific intake. We have some other data for the 1960s, which suggest that the daily caloric intake was 2100 kilocalories, of which 60% for cereals, which was much lower than in the rest of the Middle East. But I think, let's say, we should take into account, of course, let's say that this was for the majority of the population, not for the rich. Although, let's say, I think in 1970 it is reported that the daily intake had dropped from 2100 to 1620. I have a bit my doubts about that, and I think, let's say, it's either the 1960s figures are an overestimation, but I think that's not correct. So I think there's an underestimation of what was consumed. I come back to that later in the next slide, please. When we look, for example, at very detailed report from the diet of squatters in Tehran. By the way, one of the group who did that was Ghulam Hussein Saadi, who was not only a writer but also a physician. And when you see, let's say, that instead of the 1600 something kcal input, they concluded, the team from University of Tehran, that it was much higher. Nevertheless, most of it came from bread and very little from meat. In fact, it was 50% of what the FAO recommended. Despite, let's say, that these people also ate fruit, vitamin A and C intake was insufficient. Hussein Azimi did a countrywide study, and he found that despite the sufficient calorific diet, that nevertheless 44% of the Iranian population was undernourished, and that particularly in urban areas, 21% were undernourished, and that is indeed a very worrisome figure if you take into account that there was at the time that incomes in Iran nationally and also individually were rising. Nevertheless, we see, let's say, in 1979, that it was only 7 years later that the average diet was at a sufficient level, 2,400, but it fell during the Iraq-Iran war in 1986. That was a really bad year, to 2,200. But in 2005, it's skyrocketed to almost 3,500, which was 185% of the FAO recommended minimum. So Iran was getting fat. Nevertheless, when we look, let's say, at the role of wheat in this diet, 50% was still represented by bread, or 600 grams per day, which shows you, let's say, that throughout the centuries, the role of bread has basically remained unchanged, maybe from 60 to 50%, but still the most important item in the diet. Next slide, please. There were, of course, more changes in the diet. The society not only changed economically and financially, but also socially and otherwise. And what also happened is they, because of the change in regime and other things, society and the economy were under pressure of all kinds of external factors, such as high unemployment, inflation, and the sanctions, which forced people in Iran to rely on cheaper and less nutritious food, and making, let's say, it very difficult to have a healthy diet and be without any problems. In particular, and that holds, let's say, for the last 20, 25 years, adolescents have an inadequate intake of milk and dairy products, which were basically, let's say, also essential to the traditional Iranian diet, like fruit and vegetables. But instead, you see a high consumption of salty snacks, sweets, soft drinks, and junk food. I mean, am I talking about Iran or United States? I don't know. It's also interesting, let's say, that packaged products, like elsewhere in much of the world, replace not fresh products like, for example, fresh baked bread. What we see right now, that Iranians consume more sugar, fat, and oils than in the past. Of total energy consumption, and that's again is the last 20 years, 66% and 22% came from carbohydrates and fats, respectively. The source of the fat was meat and eggs, with about 22%, dairy 10%, fat and oils 58%, which shows you the problem. Although these figures are still within the dietary accepted ranges, it nevertheless meant a doubling of fat intake during the past 40 years. As a result, you see of that enormous daily intake of calories, that 55% of women and 80% of men are considered to be obese. And but not only are they obese, there are also all kinds of dietary deficiencies, so it's especially of iodine and iron, and then with the diseases that give rise to that, like iron deficiency, anemia, which are widespread. As a result, let's say, when you look at the changes, let's say that a less traditional diet, still a lot of bread, but less dairy, less fruit, less vegetables, more sugar, and junk food, and a lot of fat. That Iran right now has the same health problems as Western countries. That is, that people are obese and suffer from malnutrition, resulting in diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. In short, despite having made a revolution in 1979, Iranians are still Gharibzadeh despite themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dr. Floor, for your insightful talk. And what an evocative ending, Dr. Floor. Let's see what kind of questions that's going to produce. But at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Nader Mehravari to please join Dr. Floor for a discussion. Thank you, Dr. Mehravari.
Hello, everyone. Willem, that was a wonderful discussion and sharing all the information that you've been collecting over the years. Before I start having a conversation with Willem, I do want to emphasize something that Professor Ahmadian mentioned at the beginning of the program, that small bio that he read about Willem does not do justice for what he has contributed over the years to study of Iranian culture. So if any of you who are on a program like to find out more about his contributions, he has published quite a few books. And if you're particularly interested in his work about Iranian food and Iranian cuisine, my two favorite books of him are his book titled History of Bread in Iran, and a second book called Iranians, How Iranians Relaxed Through the Centuries, which he co-authored with Professor Hassan Javadi. So I highly recommend those two books if you have any more interest in learning about history of food and such things in Iran. And he has been very generous with his time with providing me some information over the last couple of years that I've gotten to know him. So, Willem, you probably want to turn your video on so people can see your face as we talk. When did you got interested in the subject of today's talk, and did you find it difficult to find the type of information that you needed?
Yes, you know, I am an ignoramus. When I write about things that I don't know anything about, and that's why I started out saying, when I started out, I thought chilo kebab. Well, they've been eating that for centuries. And so especially when I did my book on bread, I baked bread this morning, actually. I baked bread myself, so I'm a very great interest, and I love barbari and sangak, and especially when the bread is baked in camel dung, really crispy, nice crispy bread. You have to go with let's say Baluchistan or with the nomads. But then I found out that indeed the information about the Persian diet is really limited. I mentioned already that there are no cookbooks before the 16th centuries, and secondly, well, we have the poem by Bushak, but that gives interesting information, but not how these dishes that he mentioned are prepared. We have, let's say, fortunately, we have cookbooks from in Arabic, in particular one from the 9th century on Baghdad. And you can say, let's say, Baghdad was, I can't call it an Iranian city, but it had a large Iranian community, and it was much of its food practices were influenced by Iran's practices. So there you can draw some conclusions from. But basically, let's say you have to go through a lot of books, including poems, to find even the simple mention of a food dish. So yes, the Iranian diet is in that respect is sort of looking backwards. In the sense that we get sometimes really good data from travelers in the 19th century already. And we get very good data, but very limited in number from the 60s and the 70s from anthropologists who sit down among a tribe or in a village and ask people, okay, Monday, what did you eat for breakfast? What did you eat for lunch? What did you eat for dinner? And do that for every day of the week for over a long period. And they also ask, well, is this what you're eating today, rice? Is this typical or not typical? So then you have to extrapolate backwards. And then when you also then realize, as I mentioned earlier, that sure, let's say in the Caspian provinces, they had tons of rice, but it was no use for somebody who lived in Fars. You mentioned my book on bread. I'll give you, this is very nice example what an Iranian economist gave in 1926. I've forgotten the man's name, I'm very bad at names. But he described, let's say, the situation of having access to bread in Iran as follows. He said, you know, you are a sick man, you're living in a house on the top floor, on the first floor, they don't know what to do. So much bread they have to throw it out. But you can't go downstairs, and nor can't they, because it's too far away. And that was the problem in Iran. Let's say if in Azerbaijan there was a surplus that they let the wheat rot in the fields, people could be dying in Isfahan, and that had to do with not only that the enormous distances, but also the limited number of pack animals, which at the time when there was a famine also needed to eat. Their fodder was barley, so were competing for the foodstuff. In short, let's say Iranians were very inventive in finding all kinds of things that allowed them to survive. I briefly mentioned herbs, but I mean there is a myriad of herbs that went every year whenever they were available into the pot. Reason why they're called pottage, and I think, let's say that if people were left alone and they had a reasonable landlord, they did fine. But if they were not, and often they were not, because let's say if you know Iranian history a little bit, you know that it was a history that is rife with war, rebellions, and whatnot, and the poor people suffered as a result. Even in peacetime, when people heard that their own Persian army was passing through, they got the hell out of the village with everything they had, because they knew they would be robbed. So yes, the challenges, let's say, finding the information. It's interesting. I didn't mention it right now, but I mentioned it in my book on bread. When we look, let's say, at the cuneiform tablets from Ur and Elam, we see also already there how important bread was in the diet. In fact, all the personnel of the staff, the palace staff, was paid, and partly in food, and that was mainly bread. Something that also continued through the centuries until the beginning of the 20th century. You got your mawajib, wajire, your wages and your provisions. That was the normal reality. So Iranians look, basically, you could say by the conditions that they would live, were quasi-vegetarians, but not by choice. They liked meat like anybody else, but they couldn't afford it. I mean, you know, I thought when I started to study, at least the nomads, I mean, they would be eating meat because they had tons of these animals. But no, they couldn't afford it. I mean, that was their
source of milk, yes.
Exactly. And if they ate their piggy bank, they wouldn't survive. And the unfortunately, what we see right now, that the diet had become much better after the 50s, slowly. I mean, first for a smaller group, but but now we see, certainly in the last decade, people are poor again. And let's say if you are right now just a normal worker in Iran, you get 3 million demands in wages. You pay 2 million demands for a very simple a home. There's maybe 2-3 rooms, not more. They have 1 million to eat. Well, I tell you,
Not enough.
It's not enough.
Yes.
And so they basically beg. Well, you know, unfortunately, nobody is allowed to do, or maybe they do. The government does. No, but let's say from the impressionistic data that we have, you can say that many people have regressed to the early 20th century as diet is concerned, and that is taken into account that these people, Iran is now a highly urbanized society. In the good old days, people at least grew their own wheat, and which is, I think, it's an important thing for those people who are interested in bread. You know, in those days, bakers had their own suppliers of their own wheat. They knew their wheat. Nowadays, it's factory wheat, and so it's all standard. And let's say compared with the old days, it's tasteless. And
so you brought up the question of there were extra food maybe in Azerbaijan or by Caspian Sea, but there was no way to get it to other places. So when I look at historical information, although limited, about food practice of people who lived by Caspian Sea in Gilan and Mazandaran, and people who lived by Persian Gulf in Khuzestan, we see they ate a lot of fish. But when we look at the same time frame, the eating habits of people, say in Fars, there was no fish.
Yeah.
But that changed once refrigerated transportation became available.
Yeah.
Do you think that also the availability of being able to transport meat in a refrigerated fashion was a cause of changing diets and including more meat in people's diets?
No doubt about it, because let's say when I first came to Iran, that is now 60 years ago, when you happened into the village and it happened that a sheep was slaughtered, it had to be eaten immediately. Okay. Because it couldn't preserve it. And that was only also true for the cities, because in those days, most people didn't have a fridge. And so yes, the very fact, let's say, that you can store it for a longer period has helped enormously. There was, as I said earlier, there was some export of fish from the Persian Gulf, salted fish, and it was very much appreciated along the caravan routes where they were sold, but it was very limited. There was also a fish market in Tehran in the 19th century for fresh fish from Rasht, but it was for a very limited market, and basically from a dietary point of view, insignificant. And I think we should also note that Iran, in that respect, was not that much different from, let's say, Europe. If you look, let's say, at the European diet over the centuries, bread, let's say, take my own country, the Netherlands, bread is still very important. I mean, we eat bread for breakfast, we eat bread for lunch, and we like good bread. I mean, one of the first things that I did when I came to the States was try to eat the bread. Well, I found out they put sugar in the bread. I said, you gotta be kidding me. So I tried to find bakers who made reasonably good bread. And so after a half year, I was forced to become a baker. Fortunately, I had experience when I was 10 years old. I helped my mother baking bread. So it was trying to go back into history and read a recipe book, by the way. Very helpful. I always say, if you can read, you can cook and bake.
I had a very similar reaction when I also came to the United States with the bread.
Yes, yeah, especially Iran has excellent bread.
Yes. So now I keep looking for other reasons that might have caused the increased amount of meat in the Iranians' diet. I know in 1960s, Iran started importing large amounts of cheap sheep and lamb, particularly from New Zealand.
Yep.
Do we think that had something to do with the increase of meat in their diets?
Well, that was the result, rather. I mean, there was a demand for it. People had money. Don't forget, let's say that Iran, starting in the 1950s already, started to get richer. Well, I mean, between brackets, but relatively speaking, they have more purchasing power. And so, although they were basically damned to eat almost a vegetarian diet, they liked meat. And so you see then that local production was not enough, couldn't keep up, because that's another thing that you should realize. I mentioned, let's say, that agriculture was for auto-consumption. So that meant, let's say, that basically the level of productivity was relatively low, because it was not production for the market, it was production for your own consumption. It was, and of course, that is going to, in Iran, that's also going to change over time. If you want to read about it, I have a very thick book of 900 pages on agriculture in Iran, where you can find it all discussed in some detail. But let's say, so Iran had to import meat. Well, since traditionally beef was not eaten. If it was eaten, it was by the very poor. Goat, of course, was one option, but people prefer sheep. And then you had no other, had no choice, because let's say, despite the large availability of fish, the people were not accustomed to fish, and it took quite some time before fish became more available, even in Tehran, where there was a market for it. And I must tell you this: if you eat kali mahi, you better eat it in the Persian Gulf than in Tehran.
Yes. So you mentioned clearly in starting in 1950s when the Iranian people and the country became slightly more richer, that was a reason for diet changes. When I look at Iran's gross domestic product per capita, over 100 years between 1820 and about 1920, GDP only grew by like 50%. But then when we look at the next 50 years, it grew by 700%,
yep.
which matches your comment about, people having gotten slightly richer, that might have caused some of the changes in their diets.
Yeah, don't forget, let's say, income distribution, huh?
Right.
So of that increase, most of it went to the 1%.
Yes. You mentioned several times that the current diet of Iranians is somewhat poor. At the same time, Iran is one of the top exporters of pistachio, dates, raisins, cucumber, apples. Are people in the country not having access to them because they are exporting more and more of it?
Well, they have access to it if they can pay for it, and that's the problem. If you go to any town in Iran and look in the markets, the fruits and other are available. It's not that they're not there, but it's it is you can't afford it. Don't forget, it's interesting. You should read Amartya Sen's analysis of the Indian famine of 1942, where the point was, let's say, that people were dying. I think, I can't remember exactly, 1 million people died or so, or maybe more. It was not because there was no food. The people had no purchasing power. They couldn't afford it. The same, let's say, in Iran. If you read my book on Kermanshah, where I discuss the famine in the west of Iran, the problem was again ihtikari, which was, let's say, speculating with the wheat, and which made pricing the wheat out of people's market. Don't forget, traditionally, the well-to-do, including the middle class, didn't buy stuff in the market. They had their own village or part of the village, and that's where they got their grain and other stuff from. It was the poor who had to go to the bakery and the other thing. And then they were faced with the problem that if things were expensive, that they could either not afford the price of the bread, or the bread was kept at the same price. I mean, it's like here in the States when you buy a package which is the same price and has the same box, but the contents has been halved. Well, in Iran, they put all kinds of stuff in Iran which was non-edible, including pebbles and other stuff, so that you got very bad quality of bread. So yes,
clearly the price determines what people can have access to.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, and there was no government regulation. I just maybe also interesting for those who are interested in food. I just published, I think 3 months ago, a book, Food Security in Iran, about the Idare Arzak. That was the food administration, which was, let's say, a government agency that tried to ensure that in times of famine or shortage, there was sufficient bread in the market at affordable prices. And that was a real challenge for all kinds of reasons, which I will not go into. You can read that in that book.
Okay, very good. I wanted to just mention to all of our attendees to keep submitting questions. I've been capturing them all, and we'll try to answer them as time permits.
Wonderful, Dr. Mehravari. Sorry for the interruption. That's what I wanted to actually just mention. Thank you very much for the conversation. I would like to tell audiences that Dr. Mehravari has kindly suggested that he would moderate the Q&A with the audience, and I'm honored that he's doing this. So, you know, I'll go off the screen, but Dr. Mehravari, yeah, it would be very kind of you to actually do this. So we have some questions in the Q&A. We also have some pre-submitted questions, some of which I think were actually addressed either in the talk or in your conversation with Dr. Floor.
So there was a question from one of the audiences right away about rice in Iran. Is Iran currently self-sufficient in rice production for its domestic use? And if not, was it ever?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Let's start with the back end. In order to cultivate rice, you need water. Now, Iran is a very water-poor country. If you have water in Iran, you can grow anything. The problem is you don't have water. So the only place in Iran that was very rich in water, or was rich in water, this is changing at the moment because of climate change, the Gilan and Mazandaran. And that's where the main rice production took place traditionally. And they were more than able to satisfy demand. They even exported to Russia quite a lot. Now, coming back, let's say, to satisfying the demand, what does it mean? Don't forget, Iran, until, say, the 1930s or 50s, depending how you're going to define it, was not a national economy. Iran was a country of, say, 9-10 economies. You had the economy of Fars, you had the economy of Khuzestan, you had the economy of Azerbaijan. It didn't, as I said earlier, it didn't matter that there was a surplus in Azerbaijan if you couldn't take it to Khuzestan, for example, and it couldn't, unless, let's say, until, as in the 1930s, the government of Iran started a very important investment program of improve the infrastructure. The Idare Arzak, this the food administration, in 1925 bought, if I remember correctly, I can't remember exactly the number, 600 trucks. Now, well, before, all that food had to be loaded on mules and camels. Well, they do maybe 30 kilometers a day. Well, with a truck, you could indeed do 200 kilometers a day, or even more if you drove on. So you can see already the economies of scale working there. So when you say demand, you have to look, let's say, what was the demand that you actually could satisfy physically. Then, of course, you had the fact, let's say, that the production was rather limited. Let's say, take, for example, Isfahan. Isfahan grew rice. The Zayan route in the Linjan district, particularly where rice was grown. Shiraz had also his own rice. In fact, the Shiraz rice was very famous. But in the Persian Gulf, for example, you would say, Shiraz is only 220 kilometers from Bushehr. Well, why can't they bring it there? No, they couldn't. They imported it from India. It was cheaper. To give you an idea. So you see how difficult it is to give a definite reply about satisfying demand. Now, yes. Coming back, let's say, to Iran at the moment cannot satisfy its own national demand, because now there is indeed a national economy. It has to import, and so it gets it from the Southeast Asian countries. Whoever has like Sri Lanka or Thailand will, and that will even get more problematic in the future, because Iran is the current government is unwilling to face the issue that they have a water problem, and they're not. In fact, they're throwing ecologists who raise the issue into prison, yeah, the problem will get worse in the future, and I'm afraid that people will suffer in the future.
Yeah, and I think that problem is going to get worse. I think I saw some data from 2020 that showed rice is actually the fourth largest commodity that Iranians are importing into the country.
Yeah, together with wheat.
Yeah.
Wheat is also a very important import. Yeah.
So we had an interesting question about saffron.
Ah.
The question alludes to some historical botanists arguing that the origins of saffron in ancient time came from the region that currently is known as Greece, which is before the beginning of the Persian Empire, or about maybe 500 before Common Era. So do we know when saffron started appearing in Persian cuisine? And it's an interesting topic, since I had been looking into the same subject just a few months ago.
Okay,
so, go ahead.
Let me give you one moment. May I recommend, let's say, this book, Saffron, by Dr. Abrishami, which has everything on what has ever been written in a poem or in a text on saffron in Persian documents and chronicles and poems. To be honest, I have not looked, let's say, into the origin of saffron. Yeah, you know, I am limited in my capacity to look at all things, but now that you have something, I will look into it. But let's say saffron was produced in Iran traditionally at various sites, when everybody knows that it was, for example, produced in Sistan and across the border in Afghanistan, quite a lot. Did you know, by the way, that quite a lot was also produced in Azerbaijan, around Baku?
Yes.
So it is highly labor intensive, and therefore it costs a lot. But yeah, I can take a quick look.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be in Baku just 6 months ago, and spending some time in the bazaar.
Yeah.
There were clearly some arguments that what's grown in that area is as good as saffron that's grown in, say, Virgin. But it's interesting questions, because there is a disagreement among the historical botanists. Some argue that, as the person who asked the question states, that the origin of the saffron is from the ancient region that currently is known Greece.
Yeah.
But when we look at some of the work that was done by Alan Davidson, the famous culinary researcher, he claims that it was its origin is Western Asia and Iran and Afghanistan.
Right.
All right. We have a question. They're asking about, what can you say about the role of dairy and egg in the diets of Iranians?
Oh, that is very important. Although, as I said earlier, less important. You know, I had this very really weird experience in 1983 in Iran. I was in the restaurant, and I was so stupid to ask for dough, which is a kind of buttermilk. And they said they didn't have it. And I said, "Are you kidding me?" And they wanted to offer me Coke. Now, we were in those very revolutionary days. I said, "No, I don't want this imperialistic stuff," just to put him on a. So I said, "Have you yogurt and water? And I'll make the dough myself." Because, let's say, for Iranian peasants, which was, let's say, until the 1930s, that was 85% of the population. The day started with noon or mas. That was it. The bread and yogurt, and during the day they drink dough, one of the most healthiest drinks that I can think of. Well, they have made now a sort of popular thing with Abu Ali, which is a sort of carbonated stuff. I must say it's not bad, but I like the traditional. But it has the amount, let's say the prevalence of the use of dairy product per se in Iran has gone down in the diet, and especially on the younger generation, it is much less consumed, and instead they drink this awful stuff that American youth and European youth also drink, soft drinks and fatty things, and rather than the very healthy stuff like dairy products. Although you can drink too much of it, because there was a time that I drank a liter per day, and then my wife, who happens to be a physician, said I should not do that. So
okay. Let me ask one more question before we run out of time. This is I think it's a very interesting question. Historically speaking, Iranians, very much like Italians, they were not used to go out and eat.
Correct.
But it seems like since the revolution, Iranians now go eat out a lot.
Yeah.
Is that a reason for change in their diets? And one reason could be that because of the revolution, there aren't as many forms of social interactions or other types of entertainment.
Yeah. No, I don't think that it started with the change in how society wanted to live. Although, let's say, the official credo is we don't want to be westernized, Iran is, I would say, has become more and more Americanized as far as I see it. When I compare it, let's say, when I was there for the first time 60 years ago, and I compared it when it was the last time there, that was in 5 years ago, I find it very much Americanized. It's not only, let's say, you should realize, yes, people wanted to go more out, which was that was a thing that came from abroad. By the way, let's say where I come from the Netherlands, we didn't go out either. There's also a modern thing, and it has nothing to do. It has to do, for example, with income. Because it's cheaper to eat at home. Secondly, let's say it has to do with keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, you have your cello kebab, and I'm going to set up at the Pizza Hut, and not only that, was what struck me in 2017 when I was, let's say, whether it was in Bandar Abbas or Bushehr or Tehran, you had these guys who did takeout. You could order by phone, and they brought it on the scooter or on a motorbike, brought it home, and that was the chilo kebab to, let's say, your burger. It didn't matter, or your calabash. So I think it is a combination of factors: increase of income, increase of, let's say, well, that is another other factor of globalization. I mean, you don't see it only in Iran. You see it also, let's say, in China, which let's say, even 20 years ago, people couldn't even dream about going out eating because there was no money. So
very good. Mustafa, we are past our allotted time, so I'll leave it to, I'll pass it on to you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Mehravari and Dr. Floor. Honestly, I myself would have, I mean, I would love this conversation to just go on and on. And I know that we have more questions than the ones that have been answered. So I'm not sure if Dr. Mehravari and Dr. Floor, I'm not suggesting that we should answer all of the questions, but if you could stay maybe a couple more minutes, don't feel obliged. Don't feel obliged. So we can choose maybe one or two more questions and briefly answer them, like through Dr. Floor, if that would be great, out of respect for all of the questions that have been asked. Again, don't feel obliged.
Good. So, quick question. Willem, you mentioned artichoke in your presentation. Has artichokes been a major part of the diet?
No.
Okay.
But it became available and it was being eaten. It is mentioned, let's say, in various khatarat, let's say, memoirs of people. And again, it was something that was for the higher class.
Okay. Do you know of any studies that has been done that they might have looked into whether such Islamic rules such as hijab might have contributed to the changes in the diet?
The hijab?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think the hijab has anything to do with it. Don't forget, let's say the hijab is only for going outside. Inside, the women don't wear a hijab. And let's say among the nomads, the women don't have a hijab, or didn't have a hijab, I should say. And in the villages, I mean, everybody knew everybody, and the hijab didn't play a role. No, I think that it's the same thing. Let's say the other day I sent around a menu of hijabs, a nice picture, and it was a picture of 6 nuns from different congregations, and all had different hijabs. I mean, nowadays we say, Muslims have hijabs. In the good old days, Catholics have also hijabs, and didn't have any impact on the diet.
Yeah. Do you know if the Iranian government currently subsidizes any nutritional commodities for the population?
Oh yes, in 2000, what was it, 11 or so, or 12. Ahmadinejad started a very strong subsidy program, but even that was not enough. Also, it in the long run it is unsustainable. The government does indeed have a program where they would like to have the things available to people, but it is inefficient and is not enough.
Okay. How about the concept of organic food? Is that something that has shown up in Iran?
No. I mean, sure. I mean, in the 70s, you had people who, I mentioned the Nana Fantasie and all that sort of thing, but that is really for the westernized upper crust. Let's say 99% of the population has different problems at the moment. That's not to say that they wouldn't like to have organic food, etc. But their reality is different from ours.
I think those are all the questions that were submitted live by the audience while we were on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mehravari. Thank you, Dr. Floor. You have been great speaker and discussants. And before I ask you if you have any final remarks, I would like to again thank all of the audiences for joining us today. I would also like to mention that at the end, there will be a brief survey. It might take you like a few minutes, but that would be very helpful if you could get the time to complete it, because we will use the feedback in order to improve our work in the future. And of course, I would also like to mention that our speaker and discussant today have been generous enough with their time as well to provide their emails. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to them through email. And finally, please do join us next week, yes, on March 5th, Saturday, again at the same time, 4 p.m. PST or 7 p.m. EST, if you're in these zones, for a talk and a conversation by Dr. Janet Afri and Dr. Hassan Javadi. And the title of Dr. Afri's talk is Mola Nasruddin of Tiflis and the Transnational Diasporic Milieu that gave birth to it during 1906-1931. And at this point, I would like to ask Dr. Floor and Dr. Mehravari if they have any final remarks before we say goodbye to the audience.
I thank you for the opportunity.
I'm glad that I was able to introduce chilo kebab to the public. Go for it.
It's been a pleasure.
I prefer Khoresh, any Khoresh.
Absolutely. Again, it's been a pleasure and an honor having you both, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have you back again in the future. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day or night, wherever you are. Thank you.